Hello everyone, and thank you Chris for asking me to contribute to this month's webinar on astrophotography. Now, before I start, a health warning. This genre of photography can be very addictive. What starts out as an innocent trip out under the stars one night can quickly turn into an obsession of studying astronomical events and the weather for any opportunity to capture an image. Now, if this happens, I accept no responsibility, but will be very happy that someone else has found this amazing activity. Now, before we start, there are definitely two types of astrophotography. The deep sky imaging, where you would be using a telescope and specialist cameras to look deep inside nebulas and star clusters. These make amazing images but require very specialist equipment and skills. For me, astrophotography is the wide-angle images of the landscape under the night sky, and that is what I will be talking about in this webinar. So what are we going to cover tonight? Well, firstly, a quick look at equipment before covering the most important element of astrophotography, planning and safety. Then we will talk through how to approach things when you're out in the field before looking at some of the more advanced techniques you can use to improve your images, before a quick look at some post-processing tips. I hope you find this useful and it inspires you to get out under the night sky, but please do get in touch if you have any questions or comments. So gear. And there's good and bad news here. Good if you like buying gear at least. Astrophotography is one area of photography where gear does unfortunately matter. First, of course, you will need a camera. Any DSLR or mirrorless would work okay, but actually the lower the megapixel count the better, as they tend to suffer less from noise than the ultra high resolution 60 megapixel monsters. Chris's faithful Canon 6D is still considered one of the best astro cameras, and whereas I use a Nikon Z7 II for my main camera, I've actually just purchased the lower resolution Z6 II to improve my astro shoots. As we will see later, full frame has some advantages, but crop sensor can also be used with great results. Now, whatever camera you use, the most important thing is that you are totally familiar with it and know where every button is and how to change every setting. The last thing you want to be doing in the dark at 1 AM is trying to remember where to switch the camera to manual focus. So whilst any camera will work okay, the lenses are where you really need a fast lens. Something with an aperture of 2.8 or wider is great. But that shouldn't stop you getting out with an f4 lens, you just may need to use some of the more advanced techniques discussed later. Focal lengths also dictate how long an exposure you can take and therefore how much light you collect. Therefore, wider angle lenses tend to be more suitable. Plus the night sky is quite big. My favourite focal length is 20mm. Whatever camera and lenses you're using though, a tripod is an absolute must, and the sturdier the better. You'll be shooting for 10 to 15 seconds at a time minimum, and more if you're tracking, so need a solid base that won't move in the wind. Warm clothing, even in the summer. It gets cold at night and you can be out for a long time, so warm clothing, hats and gloves are always a good idea. If you get into shooting the winter night sky, then even warmer clothes and a good thermal base layer are brilliant. A head torch with red light option. A head torch is an absolute must for finding your way to the location in the dark and for setting up. One with a red light is really useful for if you need some light when you are on location, as the red light will not destroy your night vision in the same way that white light will. One note though, if you're at a popular location with other photographers present, no one will thank you for turning any sort of light on and ruining their shots. So this is why knowing your camera is so important. Now that's all the essential gear, but there are a few other elements you might want to consider. Firstly, a remote shutter. This is especially useful if your camera doesn't allow you to set longer shutter speeds. You don't want to be touching the camera, so if you can't dial in extended shutter speeds without using the bulb function, you will need a remote shutter. One with a built-in timer is good, as it saves you ruining your night vision by having to look at your phone to time an exposure. A lens warmer can also be really useful if you're in an environment where there is a lot of moisture, and the cold air could mean your lens fogging up. And once you get into this rather addictive genre of photography, you are probably going to end up wanting a star tracker to really bring out the detail in the sky. Okay, so you've got all your gear and you're all set to get out under stars. Well, not quite, because first you need to plan. We all know that scouting and planning is important in photography, and we all know we should do it, and then we all head out to a new location and the light kicks off and we manage to get a shot anyway, and then suddenly scouting and planning doesn't seem so important, right? Well, not with astrophotography. Unfortunately, the old adage, fail to prepare, prepare to fail, really does hold true for astro. The first thing to consider is the moon phase and rise and set times, and how this impacts what you might shoot. As this photo of Compton Bay under the full moon shows, whilst a full moon can be a really great time to shoot, if your aim is to capture the Milky Way in all its glory, a full moon will completely wash the sky out. So ideally you want to shoot when there is a new moon, or the weeks either side of the new moon, when the moon will rise and set during the night, as opposed to around the full moon, when the moon will be in the sky the whole night. I use photo pills to track the moon phases and the rise and set time to make sure the moonlight matches what I want to shoot. Next up, the weather. And whilst we might encourage ourselves to get out and shoot in any weather during the day, there is only one thing we are looking for astrophotography: clear skies. I use a multitude of apps and websites to check the weather and tend to just keep looking until I find the answer I'm looking for. First, I will use clear outside. It might be terrible for predicting fog, but I do find it's fairly reliable for predicting clear skies. And then combine that with windy or venture sky to confirm. Make sure though you check for the time that your intended night sky object will be visible to ensure the clear sky lines up with the time you are planning to shoot. So the happy conjunction of a new moon and the forecast clear skies is approaching, and you're all set to get out. However, there is one more vital step: scouting. The first thing to do is find a dark sky location, and the darker the better. You can start to get good images from Bortle class 5, but 4 onwards works best. And the Bortle scale runs from 1 to 10 to classify how dark a sky is, with 1 being the best. The general rule though is to get as far away from a city or large town as possible, and then if possible, shoot away from the nearest large light area. Shooting on the coast is very popular, as you can shoot out over the sea or ocean where light pollution is generally much lower. One thing to note about light pollution though, it can be picked up from a long way away. I often shoot looking out over the English Channel and can still get light pollution from northern French coast, easily 30 miles away. Once you have found a general dark sky location, it's a case of finding something interesting to shoot. And remember, for wide-angle astrophotography, the same applies as for daytime photography. All the topics Chris has covered about composition, storytelling, all still apply in order to get a great shot. So I always start with the Ordnance Survey map to look for a location that might work. And then, having worked out which direction I would be facing, I look at Stellarium, which is available in both web format and an app, to see what is happening in the night sky at different times of the year in that direction. For Astro, it helps to have a bank of locations that work in different directions for all the different events that happen in an astronomical year. Once I've had an idea of where to go, it's a case of visiting the location and working out your exact composition. I use photo pills, which has an AR functionality to overlay the Milky Way over the view from your phone's camera, so you can work out exactly where it will be visible at different times and how it will align with your composition, so you know exactly where to stand when you return. Unfortunately, this only works for the Milky Way, but if you know where other constellations are in relation to the Milky Way, through using Stellarium, you can work out your composition. Plus, Orion and the Milky Way follow the same path through the sky. Orion in winter, the Milky Way in summer, so work out your composition for one and you have it for the other. Not many scouting trips can give you 2 shots for 1 trip. Now, whilst out scouting, it's really important to pay attention to your surroundings. What dangers could there be? Things that might not seem like a big issue in the middle of the day can be real hazards in the night. A hole in the ground that you might not see, a cliff edge, livestock, rocks to trip over, other people are all things to consider. It really is a case of safety first. So having planned your shot, scouted your location, checked for hazards, and counted the happy coincidence of a clear night and a new moon, it's time to get out under the magic of the night sky. Unfortunately, before you can relax and watch the stars pass by, there is one final challenge: some math. The basic settings for astrophotography are actually very straightforward, and once you have them worked out, it's very easy as they tend to be repeatable each time you go out. The first thing to do though is make sure you put everything in manual, especially your focus settings. Autofocus will not work in the dark, and you don't want your camera hunting for focus when you try to take a picture. So both the body and lens, if they both have mode switches, should be in manual. It's also worth putting your white balance in manual, especially if you are trying a panorama or tracking or stacking images, as you don't want the white balance changing over the course of your shots. which it will as the night sky changes. Then aperture, which is as wide as your lens will go. f2.8 or wider is brilliant, but go with whatever your widest aperture is. ISO needs to be high. I tend to start around 6400 and adjust if necessary. The reason your ISO needs to be so high is there is not much light around at night, and unfortunately your shutter speed is restricted. One of the challenges of astrophotography is gathering enough light whilst dealing with the rotation of the Earth. If you keep the shutter open too long, you will get trailing in the stars as the Earth rotates. There is, however, a nice formula to calculate your maximum shutter speed called the 500 rule. Don't ask me to explain the science behind it, but it works. Simply divide 500 by your focal length. The wider you are, the longer you can have your shutter speed before seeing trailing in the stars. So for a 20mm focal length, divide 500 by 20 and you get 25 seconds. If you're using a crop sensor, it's important to multiply your focal length by the crop factor first. So if you're on a 1.5 times crop, your 20mm focal length becomes 30 and your maximum shutter speed is therefore 500 divided by 30, so 16 seconds. One word of caution. This rule doesn't work brilliantly on higher megapixel cameras. Again, I can't explain the science, but it doesn't. Therefore, it is recommended for higher resolution cameras to use 300 rather than 500. For reference, I tend to stick to about 15 seconds at 20mm on my 45 megapixel camera. Of course, as this image of Bembridge Windmill shows, star trails can be an artistic choice to show how the Earth rotates, and can be particularly effective if you have a view of Polaris and you can get these tight circles around the North Star. On this occasion there was a nearly full moon in the sky, which lit up the windmill and ground nicely. Phew, that's the maths done. One final hurdle to overcome though before capturing that first image of the night sky. Focusing. As mentioned previously, autofocus will not work, and if you have your camera in auto, there is a risk that it will try and focus when you press the shutter and therefore lose focus. So make sure everything is in manual focus. In many ways, focusing for the night sky is easy. It's a long way away, so it's definitely a case of focusing to infinity. Unfortunately, infinity is not actually easy to find on your lens. It's not just a case of turning your lens as far as the focus ring will go. Infinity is somewhere near the end of your focus, but not right at the end. Finding the sweet spot definitely becomes easier with practice, but it will take some practice. The best technique is to use your live view and zoom into the brightest star you can see in the sky. Or if there is a light source on the ground a suitable distance away, you can use that as well. Then it's a case of playing with the focus ring until you get the star as small as possible. You do need to play, so go past the focus point until the star gets larger again and then turn back until you have it sharp again. Play with that a few times until you're satisfied you have it right, then take a test shot and see if you have pinpoint stars. If you struggle to see enough detail on the live view screen, a loupe is a useful tool to magnify the screen and make sure you have pinpoint stars. Right, now I promise that's all the setting up done. It might seem a lot of effort, and some might be thinking it's more effort than it's worth, but trust me, once you've done it a couple of times it becomes second nature, and being out under the stars is well worth the effort. So now with the settings nailed, it's important to consider what makes a good astrophotograph. And the good news here is that there really isn't anything new to learn, because the important point is that what makes a good astrophotograph is the same as what makes a good photo. Composition and narrative and all those other elements covered in previous webinars hold true here too. One extra element to consider though is that at night there is a lack of contrast, and so everything can look very flat. Therefore a strong subject is even more important. Here in this image from Newtown Creek, the old boathouse provides a strong primary subject with the great rift of the Milky Way in the sky. On this occasion, the lights from the mainland and the start of twilight added some light onto the foreground, adding additional contrast. A strong subject rising above the horizon can be a really good composition and avoids the feel of the image being two elements with the sky and foreground feeling disconnected. In this image of the Yarborough Monument, the subject passes through the Milky Way and provides that connection between the ground and subject and the night sky. Unfortunately, the stars and planets are not the only objects in our night sky. More and more satellites are being placed into orbit, and these items will unfortunately reflect sunlight and leave strong white lines through your image. There's no way to avoid this, unfortunately, so your only option is to remove them in post-processing, or embrace them, as I have in these images of a train of Starlink satellites passing above the War Shrine at Haven Street, or the International Space Station passing above the Ursa Major constellation at Newtown. Airplane light trails are another issue, especially if you're on a flight path or for a major airport. Another option to add interest into an image is to use light painting, where you can place a light within the image, as I have here of this image of St. Catherine's Oratory, or to highlight elements of your composition with a torch whilst taking the shot. Be aware though, at the high ISO settings you will be operating at, it is very easy to blow out elements of the image, or even the whole image, with overuse of light painting. So any light should be at a very low level, or if you can't control the level, just use it for a very short period. It's a case of experimenting to get it right. Adding yourself into the image, as I have done here, can be a great way of adding scale and showing just how vast the night sky is in comparison to us. Just make sure you've checked where you will place yourself for any dangers during your daytime scouting. One recommendation though, don't shine your head torch into the night sky. It's a very cliche shot, and actually you want as little light going into the sky as possible. I mean, do it, as I did here in the very early shot I took, but then get it out of your system and move on. One other element to be aware of is the timing of your shoot. This is why scouting is so important and the AR function on apps is so valuable. In this image at St. Catherine's, I got the timing very wrong. So the composition fails because the eye is drawn to the lighthouse, but then there is no easy route for the eye to travel to the Milky Way core in the sky above. Whereas on this occasion, the timing was aligned and the light from the lighthouse shone out to the Milky Way core, making the image flow better. On this occasion as well, I captured the green air glow. This is not the aurora, but a faint emission of light from the Earth's atmosphere itself. It can be very easy to become focused on the Milky Way, and particularly the core, and it is a great subject for a photo, with its gases and dust channels providing an amazing insight into the centre of our galaxy. However, there is so much more to the night sky, and many other constellations to photograph. In this shot from Portland in Dorset, I turned the camera to the north to capture Ursa Major, also known as the Plough, or the Big Dipper for our American friends, above the huts at Portland. One thing to note when shooting the constellations, your camera will pick up so many stars that the constellations will get lost a bit. Whilst they stand out to your eye as they are brighter, they will be lost in a sea of stars. For this image, I used the Case Star Glow filter, which acts like a layer of fog and cuts out the smaller stars, allowing the brighter stars of the constellation to shine through. It's also worth keeping an eye out for any special astronomical events, as they can be amazing to photograph. There are annual events like the Perseid or Geminid meteor showers, or rarer events such as when Comet Neowise, captured here, visited the night sky in the summer of 2020. And don't forget our old friend the moon. Yes, it can be the curse when you want to capture the stars, but it can also make a great subject in its own right. And moonlight on the land is just beautiful and a nice change to golden hour light, as this image of the Needles shows, with the lights of Poole and Bournemouth in the distance. If shooting the moon, you can use the same shutter speed calculation, but reduce your ISO a lot as it's really bright. This image was shot at ISO 500. Talking of the moon, another option is to photograph the moonrise, as with this image of the full moon rising over Bembridge Lifeboat Station. The trick here is to be a long way away from your subject and use a very long focal length to get that compression effect to make the moon look really big against your subject. 400mm is a minimum, as I used here. You really want to be a couple of miles away from your subject. So all of the above tips will create a great single image shot of the night sky, which will be great, but will also have some limitations. One of the biggest issues is noise. Shooting a digital camera at the really high ISO levels needed creates digital noise in your image, which can really impact the detail in the image, particularly in the foreground. Modern processing software can help remove this noise, but there are two techniques that can be used to help reduce the level of noise in the base image. I won't cover these in too much detail, as they could be multiple webinars on their own, but we'll give a few overviews. Firstly, stacking. This image from Watcombe Bay is a stacked image. This is simply a technique where multiple images are taken one after another and then combined in specialist software. Unfortunately, you do need specialist software, as the stars will move during your series of shots. What the software does is moves the sky element back of the shots back on top of each other whilst not moving the land. It's basically a very clever algorithm. As the stars are constant, whereas noise is random, by doing this, the software eliminates the noise as it doesn't appear in every image. This also has the advantage of removing satellite or aeroplane trails. For Mac users, there is Starry Landscape Stacker, which you do have to pay for, whereas for Windows users, there is free software called Sequitur. The next option is to track, and using a star tracker that rotates at the same pace as the Earth rotates, you can shoot for much longer periods and not get trailing in the stars. This image of the Milky Way over St. Catherine's shows a detail that can be pulled out through tracking. Tracking also allows you to shoot at lower ISOs, which allows more colour to come through. Shooting at high ISO will kill the colours. There are a couple of complications with this technique. Firstly, you need to polar align using a polar scope in order to line the star tracker up with the poles. This is fairly easy in the Northern Hemisphere, where you can just point at Polaris, but more tricky in the Southern Hemisphere. Also, you need to take separate images for the foreground and the sky. As the camera will be moving as it tracks the stars, your foreground will be blurred. So you then need to take additional images with the tracker turned off to capture the foreground and blend the two images together in post-processing. This does give the advantage of being able to use a much longer exposure for the ground, and therefore a lower ISO to also reduce the noise. It is, though, fair to say if you're not a fan of post-processing, these advanced techniques are not for you. Now, for the ultimate detail, you track multiple shots and then you stack them, as I did for this shot of the Milky Way over the oilseed rape fields, which also includes a meteor from the Leonard meteor shower. Post-processing. Now, bad news for anyone who doesn't enjoy time in front of the computer processing images. Night sky images do take a lot of processing, especially if you get into the advanced techniques of tracking and stacking that we've just discussed. I won't be talking in detail about post-processing, but just giving a few hints and tips. One important point though, if you do get into tracking, you will also need to be comfortable blending two images together. When you track your sky, the ground will be blurred, so you will need to blend the sky with a second non-tracked image of your foreground. The sky replacement tool in Photoshop does a great job of this if you're an Adobe user. For single images though, you can manage most things in just Lightroom or equivalent. However, the first thing to know is when you open your RAW files, you will be disappointed. When you're out in the field and look at your images on the LCD screen, they look so bright and vibrant and so much detail is there. But that's because your screen is bright against the dark of the night you are out in. And that isn't the same when you first look at your RAW file in Lightroom. However, do not panic. All the detail you need has still been captured. You just need to tease it out a bit. So these are my top 10 tips for post-processing. A single image file will be very noisy, so apply some noise reduction, but not too much, as you can create a very mushy file if you go too far. 2. The Milky Way is not cigar-shaped, so don't apply a radial mask to the area, as this can look very unnatural. Use the brush tool instead to dodge and burn the bright and dark areas to increase the contrast. White balance. Obviously this is a personal choice, but I tend to use the selector tool, the little pipette icon in Lightroom, and select a part of the night sky without any stars, and this tends to set the white balance the closest to what it actually was. Contrast. You need to bring out the contrast in the night sky, so use the whites and blacks sliders to enhance the contrast, along with the highlights and shadows tools. Number 5. Foreground. As you can see here, it will be dark, but the more you raise the shadows in a single image, the more you introduce noise. And you also tend to get purple tones in the shadows, which is colour noise, so go careful. If you want a super detailed foreground, you will need to take multiple images and stack them to reduce noise. 6. Colours. Play with the HSL panel to see what colours you captured in the night sky. See if you've got any airglow maybe. They won't initially be visible in your raw file. 7. Satellites and airplanes trails. These will be difficult to remove in a single image, but can be done so in Photoshop using the spot removal tool. 8. Remember it is a night shot, so the foreground should be on the darker side. 9. Dodging and burning is your friend. To really bring out elements in the night sky, use the dodge and burn tools, but just be soft with them to make sure you don't make it look too unnatural. 10. Be subtle with colours. It can be tempting to really go to town on the HSL panel and make the Milky Way bright magenta, but for me personally, subtle is best. With a little work, it is possible to really bring those flat raw files to life. So that's all for this webinar. I hope you found it useful. Just before I go, a little recap of the main points. Planning is so important for success. Finding the composition and going out on the right night requires planning. Safety first. This is so important. Scout for dangers during the daytime before visiting at night. Composition is just as important at night. All the same rules apply. I've talked a lot about the Milky Way, and it's wonderful to photograph, but the night sky is so much more than the Milky Way. Look for other constellations, meteor showers, planetary alignments, and even the moon. Remember the 500 or 300 rule calculation to keep your shutter speed short enough to avoid trailing in the stars. And be subtle with your post-processing to both avoid introducing more noise and retain a natural look. And most importantly, if you do head out to photograph the night sky, enjoy it, and I wish you clear skies. Many thanks for listening, and goodbye.